Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who smile at you across the dinner table. Valerie's perfect life begins to unravel when she realizes her husband and sister-in-law might be working together to destroy her, but they never expected her to fight back. The warm morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Samantha Hastings' opulent Atlanta home. The marble floors gleamed, and the crystal chandelier above the dining table sparkled, casting delicate rainbows across the room. 30-year-old Valerie Monroe adjusted the hem of her cream-colored blouse and took a deep breath, preparing herself for another brunch filled with thinly veiled barbs and forced smiles. Samantha, always the perfect hostess, sat at the head of the table, her blonde hair styled in loose waves, a designer silk dress hugging her slender frame. Across from Valerie sat her husband Ryan, whose charm had once swept Valerie off her feet, but lately his easy smile felt more like a mask than a reflection of the man she thought she knew. "Valerie, darling," Samantha cooed, pouring coffee into a delicate porcelain cup. "Ryan insisted on making the coffee himself today. He's become quite the barista, haven't you, dear?" Ryan chuckled softly, but Valerie noticed the way his fingers drummed nervously against the table. "It's a special brew," he said, sliding the cup toward her. "Just for you." Valerie leaned in slightly, the aroma hitting her immediately. Something was off. The rich, familiar scent of coffee was overshadowed by something sharp and metallic. Her stomach churned, a wave of unease washing over her. She flashed a quick smile, masking her suspicion. "How thoughtful," she replied, her voice calm despite the rapid beating of her heart. Samantha's eyes gleamed with something Valerie couldn't quite place. Amusement? Anticipation? She stirred her own coffee lazily, not yet taking a sip. "He's been practicing different brewing methods. All for you, Valerie." The emphasis on the last words made Valerie's skin crawl. She'd learned to be cautious, especially after months of mysterious illnesses that always seemed to follow meals prepared or served by Samantha. She thought back to the herbal tea Samantha had given her last month, which had landed her in urgent care, and the breakfast 2 months ago that left her violently ill for days. No. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the cup, bringing it close but not drinking. She stole a glance at Ryan. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Samantha watched intently, the corners of her lips twitching in a barely concealed smirk. Valerie's mind raced. Was this it? Another attempt to make her sick, or worse? With a feigned gasp, Valerie jolted up from her chair, clutching her phone. "Oh no, I completely forgot about a work call I need to make," she said quickly. "Samantha, may I use your study?" Samantha's eyes narrowed just slightly before she nodded. "Of course, dear. Just don't break anything," she replied sweetly. As Valerie passed by Samantha's seat, she stumbled deliberately, her hand grazing the edge of the table. In the moment of confusion, she deftly switched the coffee cups. "Oops, sorry about that," she murmured, steadying herself. Samantha waved it off with a tight smile, oblivious to Valerie's sleight of hand. Once inside the study, Valerie left the door ajar just enough to keep an eye on the dining table. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she waited. Seconds felt like hours. Samantha lifted the coffee cup to her lips, taking a delicate sip. Valerie held her breath. At first, nothing happened. Ryan scrolled through his phone, seemingly unconcerned. Samantha chatted idly about an upcoming charity gala, but then Valerie noticed it. A faint tremor in Samantha's hand as she set down the cup. Her expression shifted, confusion flickering across her face. "Ryan," Samantha whispered, her voice unsteady. "Something's wrong." Ryan's eyes snapped to her, and realization dawned on his face like a slow-motion car crash. No, that wasn't supposed to be your cup," he muttered, panic creeping into his tone. Samantha's eyes widened, her face draining of color. "What did you put in my coffee?" she rasped. Valerie, still hidden, clutched her phone tightly, recording every word. Ryan rushed to Samantha's side, his calm facade crumbling. "It wasn't meant for you," he whispered urgently. But the room was so silent that Valerie heard every syllable as if they were shouted. Samantha's breathing became ragged and her hands trembled violently. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. "Call an ambulance," she gasped, her voice laced with desperation. Valerie stepped out from the study, her phone still recording. "Already on it," she said firmly. dialing 911 with steady hands despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Ryan turned to face her, eyes wide with shock and fear. Samantha collapsed to the floor, clutching at Ryan's arm. "Valerie, you switched them," Samantha choked out, realization dawning too late. "Yes," Valerie replied coldly. "And now I know the truth." As sirens echoed in the distance, Valerie's heart pounded, not with fear, but with determination. The mask had slipped, and there was no turning back. Valerie sat in the study, the soft glow of her phone illuminating her face as she discreetly recorded the scene unfolding in the dining room. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest as she watched Samantha's fingers curl around the coffee cup, the very one Valerie had switched just moments before. Please let me be wrong, she thought, but deep down, she knew the truth. Samantha brought the cup to her lips and took a sip. For a moment, nothing happened. Valerie's stomach twisted in knots. Had she overreacted? Was this all a cruel coincidence her mind had fabricated? But then she noticed it, a flicker of discomfort crossing Samantha's face. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the cup down. Ryan, still glued to his phone, didn't seem to notice at first. Valerie clenched her phone tighter, capturing every second. Suddenly, Samantha's breathing grew shallow, her eyes widening in panic. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Something's wrong." Ryan looked up, his face contorting from confusion to horror as realization dawned on him. He shot up from his seat, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "You drank from the wrong cup," he whispered harshly, his voice filled with dread. Valerie's pulse spiked. The wrong cup? Her suspicion hardened into certainty. She had been right all along. Samantha's hands trembled violently as she clutched the edge of the table. What did you put in the coffee, Ryan?" Valerie's mind raced. She hit stop on the recording and immediately started another, ensuring every word was captured. She needed this evidence. She needed proof of their betrayal. Ryan knelt beside Samantha, panic in his eyes. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It was supposed to be just enough to make her sick. Not you. Never you." Valerie's breath caught. The pieces clicked into place. The constant illnesses, the unexplained hospital visits, the mysterious metallic taste in her drinks. They were trying to poison me. A wave of nausea washed over her, but she forced herself to stay focused. She had to act fast. Valerie grabbed her phone and dialed 911 with one hand while keeping the other on the recording button. 911, what's your emergency?" a calm voice answered. "My sister-in-law is having a severe reaction to something she drank. We need an ambulance at 625 Pinecrest Drive. Please hurry," Valerie whispered, keeping her voice low. Her eyes never left the dining room. Samantha's breathing was rapid, her body trembling uncontrollably now. "Call an ambulance," Samantha gasped, barely able to speak. "I already have," Valerie said, stepping out of the study, her phone recording still active. Ryan's head whipped around, his face pale as a sheet. "Valerie," he began, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "Don't," she said, her voice firm despite the turmoil inside her. "I heard everything." Samantha's eyes locked onto Valerie's, realization dawning. "You switched them," she whispered, the betrayal evident in her voice. Valerie's lips pressed into a thin line. "I had to be sure." The sound of distant sirens pierced the air, growing louder as they approached. Ryan's hands trembled as he tried to help Samantha, but it was clear he was just as lost as she was. "What were you thinking, Ryan?" Valerie demanded, tears stinging her eyes. "How could you?" Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but Samantha's weak voice cut through the tension. "You said, just enough to make her sick. Enough to keep her from the pitch next week. You promised it wouldn't be traced." Valerie's breath hitched. The pitch, next week's meeting with the biggest client her company had ever secured. Samantha had always been competitive, but this was beyond comprehension. The front door burst open and paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. Valerie stepped aside, pointing them toward Samantha. "She drank coffee that may have been tampered with," Valerie explained quickly. "Please help her." As the paramedics worked, Ryan's panic morphed into anger. "You don't understand," he snapped at Valerie. "We were trying to help you." "Help me?" Valerie's voice cracked. "By poisoning me?" Samantha, now being lifted onto the stretcher, locked eyes with Valerie one last time. "You ruined everything," she whispered, before being wheeled out. Valerie's phone buzzed in her hand, a text from her lawyer confirming the recording had been backed up to the cloud. She exhaled slowly, her hands still shaking. Ryan stood there speechless as the paramedics left with Samantha. Valerie looked at him one last time, her voice steady but cold. "We're done, Ryan. The police will want to hear everything you two had planned, and I'll make sure they do." As the front door closed behind the paramedics, Ryan finally realized what Valerie had known for a while now. There was no escaping the truth anymore. The waiting room of Atlanta General Hospital buzzed with quiet tension, the sterile white walls pressing in on Valerie as she sat, phone in hand, replaying the recording she had captured at brunch. Every whispered word, every frantic admission, it was all there. Evidence. Her heart pounded relentlessly as she scrolled through her messages, ensuring the file had been sent to her lawyer, her private email, and even a trusted colleague. She wasn't taking any chances. "Family of Samantha Carter?" a nurse called out. Valerie stood, swallowing hard. "Ryan's not here," she realized. After mumbling something about parking the car, he had vanished. "I'm her sister-in-law," Valerie said, her voice steady. "How is she?" The nurse's expression was grave. "She's stable, but the doctors found some concerning substances in her system. Dr. Phillips will explain more." Valerie followed the nurse through the double doors, her pulse quickening. This is it. Dr. Phillips, a tall woman with sharp eyes and graying hair, greeted her outside Samantha's room. "Mrs. Monroe, I need to ask, do you know what your sister-in-law ingested today?" Valerie took a deep breath and held out her phone. "I think you should listen to this." As the recording played, Dr. Phillips's neutral expression morphed into one of disbelief and then concern. "This is very serious," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We detected toxins that don't appear accidentally in food or drink. This was deliberate." Valerie nodded, her suspicions now undeniable. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Valerie turned to see Ryan approaching, his face pale and damp with sweat. He must have overheard the doctor because his eyes darted nervously between Valerie and Dr. Phillips. "Valerie," he started, calling her by her full name in that pleading tone she had grown to distrust. "I can explain." Dr. Phillips pressed the nurse's call button. "Security to room 214, please." Ryan raised his hands defensively. "Wait, this is all a misunderstanding." Valerie's fingers tightened around her phone. "A misunderstanding?" "Ryan, I have proof," she said, voice shaking. She scrolled through her phone and held up the messages she had forwarded from his phone last week. "These texts between you and Samantha, about keeping me out of commission before the Henderson pitch, were those misunderstandings too?" Ryan's face drained of color. You went through my phone?" "Yes," Valerie snapped. "After finding that vial in your desk drawer, what else was I supposed to do?" Dr. Phillips interjected, her expression grim. "We need to run tests to compare the substances we found in Mrs. Carter's system with any toxins you may have been exposed to, Mrs. Monroe." Valerie nodded. "Please, I've been hospitalized 3 times in the last 6 months. I need to know if it's connected." 2 security guards approached, standing on either side of Ryan. He looked panicked, searching for an escape. "We were trying to protect you," he insisted. "You were working too hard. Samantha said if we just slowed you down—" "By poisoning me?" Valerie's voice cracked. "How long, Ryan? How long have you been doing this? Was it you at the Christmas party?" Ryan's silence was answer enough. From behind the glass of her hospital room, Samantha watched the scene unfold, fear flickering in her eyes. Valerie wondered if she was trying to figure out how to spin this, how to manipulate the situation one last time. "Detective Ramirez is on her way," Dr. Phillips informed Valerie. "She specializes in cases like this." Valerie exhaled, feeling the weight of the truth settling on her shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but the unveiling had begun. Valerie sat in a small, sterile interview room at the hospital, the walls closing in as the weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. Across from her, Detective Ramirez, a sharp-eyed woman with short black hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, clicked her pen and began taking notes. "You've done an impressive job documenting everything," the detective said, glancing through Valerie's files, text messages, and recordings. "Most people don't think to do this until it's too late." "I started noticing a pattern months ago," Valerie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I had an important client meeting or presentation, I'd get sick. It wasn't just coincidence." Ramirez nodded. "And you said the doctors couldn't pinpoint what was causing your symptoms?" "Exactly," Valerie replied. "But after the third time, I knew it wasn't random. That's when I started keeping detailed records of everything. When I ate, what I drank, who I was with." The detective looked at the timeline Valerie had compiled. Each incident was meticulously logged, complete with dates, times, and symptoms. Ramirez's pen paused. "And the coffee today?" "It was supposed to be for me," Valerie said, her hands clenching in her lap. "I switched the cups with Samantha's at the last second. I didn't plan to. I just panicked." The door creaked open, and Dr. Phillips stepped in, holding a tablet. "Detective, we ran the toxicology tests on Mrs. Carter and compared them to previous samples from Mrs. Monroe's past hospitalizations." Valerie held her breath. "There's a match," the doctor continued grimly. "We found traces of a specific compound used in pharmaceutical trials. It's not something the general public can easily access." Detective Ramirez's jaw tightened. "Any idea how they got it?" Dr. Phillips nodded. "We found it in Ryan's office at Samantha's firm. He stole it from a college friend working in pharmaceutical research. There were several bottles, along with notes detailing dosages and the effects after each exposure." Valerie's stomach churned. They were experimenting on me?" "It appears so, Doctor." Phillips confirmed. "They were tracking how much was needed to cause illness without being lethal. But today's dose, if you had drunk that coffee, it would have been fatal." A shiver ran down Valerie's spine. She blinked away tears, determination hardening her features. "I want them both held accountable." Just then, another officer entered the room, holding an evidence bag with the bottles and notes found in Ryan's office. Ramirez examined them closely, her expression growing darker. "We have enough," Ramirez said firmly. "I'm placing both Ryan Monroe and Samantha Carter under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, and illegal possession of pharmaceutical substances." Valerie let out a shaky breath, relief mingling with shock. It was really happening. As Ramirez left to coordinate the arrests, Valerie whispered to herself, "It's finally over." But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of her journey to heal and rebuild. Valerie sat alone in the hospital waiting room, her fingers nervously tapping on her phone screen. The weight of everything that had just unfolded pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Ryan and Samantha, two people she had once trusted, had meticulously planned to sabotage her, and worse, they had nearly succeeded in ending her life. Her thoughts were interrupted when Detective Ramirez approached, a stern expression on her face. "Valerie, we've arrested Ryan," she said calmly, sitting down next to her. "Samantha will be charged as soon as she's medically cleared." Valerie's heart clenched. "How did he react?" Ramirez sighed. "Denial at first. But when we confronted him with the text messages, the recordings, and the toxicology reports, he knew there was no way out." Valerie swallowed the lump in her throat. "Did he say why? I mean, I know why, but did he admit it?" The detective nodded. "He said it was never supposed to go this far. At first it was just about slowing you down professionally. But Samantha, she pushed him to do more." Valerie's voice trembled. "So, it was Samantha's idea?" Ramirez shook her head. "Ryan made his own choices. But Samantha's jealousy fueled everything. She saw your success as a direct threat to her own. Ryan claimed he was trying to protect you from burning out, but let's be honest, that's a weak excuse for what they did." Valerie's head dropped into her hands. She thought back to all the moments she had doubted herself, all the times she had felt guilty for suspecting them. Now the truth was undeniable. "Can I see him?" she whispered. Ramirez hesitated, then nodded. "He's in custody at the station. I can arrange it if you're sure." "I need closure," Valerie replied softly. An hour later, Valerie found herself in a small interrogation room at the police station. Ryan sat on the other side of the table, his wrists cuffed and his head down. He looked up when she entered, guilt clouding his eyes. "Val," he started, but she held up a hand. "Don't," she interrupted. "I need to say this." Ryan nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I trusted you," Valerie said, her voice trembling but firm. "I loved you. And you tried to ruin me. You almost killed me." He opened his mouth to respond, but she pressed on. "Do you know how many nights I lay awake wondering if I was imagining things? If I was being paranoid? And the whole time you and Samantha were plotting behind my back." Ryan's eyes welled with tears. "I never wanted to hurt you." Valerie scoffed, shaking her head. "But you did. Over and over again. Why, Ryan? Was my success really that threatening to you?" He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "Samantha convinced me that if you kept climbing, you'd leave me behind. She said I needed to slow you down just for a little while." Valerie's voice hardened. "So, you poisoned me?" Ryan's silence was answer enough. "I'm done," she said, standing up. "I'll testify against you both. I'll make sure you never hurt anyone else again." She turned to leave, but Ryan's voice stopped her. "Valerie, I'm sorry." Without turning back, she whispered, "It's too late for that." As she walked out, the weight on her chest began to lift. She wasn't free yet, but for the first time she felt like she could be. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people filed in, their whispers mingling with the sound of shuffling papers and clicking heels. Valerie sat at the front, her hands tightly clasped together in her lap. Her lawyer, Ms. Carter, leaned over and whispered, "You're ready for this? Just tell the truth." Valerie nodded, but her heart pounded in her chest like a drum. She glanced to her left where Ryan and Samantha sat at the defendant's table. Ryan looked disheveled, his usual confident charm replaced by a vacant, defeated stare. Samantha, however, still held her head high, though the flicker of fear in her eyes betrayed her facade. The judge entered and the room fell silent. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Judge Simmons presiding. The trial began with the prosecution laying out the case. The recordings Valerie had made, the toxicology reports from the hospital, and the stolen substances found in Ryan's office were presented piece by piece. Each new detail painted a damning picture of betrayal and intent. Valerie listened as the prosecution played her recording from that fateful brunch. Ryan's hushed voice echoed through the courtroom. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Samantha's voice followed, sharp and desperate. "You promised it wouldn't be traced." Valerie clenched her fists, reliving the moment that had changed everything. When it was her turn to testify, Valerie took a deep breath and approached the witness stand. She swore to tell the truth, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Mrs. Monroe," the prosecutor began, "can you describe your relationship with the defendants?" Valerie's eyes flicked to Ryan, then to Samantha. "Ryan is my husband. Samantha is his sister, my sister-in-law." "And when did you first suspect something was wrong?" "It started small," Valerie explained. "A stomach ache here, a dizzy spell there. I thought it was just stress. But then, the incidents became more frequent. Every time I ate or drank something they gave me, I ended up sick. At first I thought it was bad luck, but then I knew it wasn't." The prosecutor nodded. "What led you to record the brunch conversation?" Valerie's voice hardened. "I had to be sure. I'd already been hospitalized multiple times, and no one could explain why. I started keeping records, but I needed proof. That day, when the coffee smelled off, I knew. I switched the cups and recorded what happened next." The defense attorney tried to discredit her, suggesting it was all circumstantial, but Valerie's calm, detailed testimony held firm. She presented text messages she had saved, voice recordings she had secretly captured, and her meticulous documentation of each incident. The most damning moment came when Detective Ramirez presented the stolen substances found in Ryan's office. "These were obtained illegally and used repeatedly over several months," she stated, holding up the evidence bag. Finally, Ryan was called to testify. His lawyer had warned him, but Ryan insisted on taking the stand. His hands trembled as he spoke. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said quietly. "Samantha, she pushed me. She said Valerie was going to overshadow us both, that we had to do something. Did you ever try to stop it? The prosecutor asked. Ryan's silence was deafening. When Samantha took the stand, she was less remorseful. It wasn't personal, she sneered. Valerie thought she was better than me. She took clients that should have been mine. I was protecting my career. By poisoning her? The prosecutor pressed. Samantha shrugged, but her confident mask was slipping. The closing arguments were swift. The prosecution highlighted the overwhelming evidence, the premeditated nature of the crimes, and the clear intent behind each act. The defense argued for leniency, claiming it was a moment of poor judgment, not malice. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, the verdict was clear. On the charges of attempted murder and conspiracy, we find the defendants guilty. Valerie felt her knees weaken with relief as the words echoed in the silent courtroom. Ryan slumped in his seat, defeated, while Samantha's face twisted in disbelief. Judge Simmons looked sternly at them. Your actions displayed a blatant disregard for human life and trust. The court sentences you both to the maximum penalty under the law. As the gavel fell, sealing their fate, Valerie closed her eyes and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It wasn't triumph she felt, but peace. A year had passed since that fateful day in the courtroom. Valerie stood at the podium, a sea of faces watching her in anticipation. The Atlanta Business Leaders Conference was one of the most prestigious events in the industry, and Valerie Monroe was the keynote speaker. She smoothed her tailored navy blazer and took a deep breath. The spotlight felt warm on her face, but unlike the nervous energy she used to feel in moments like this, today she stood tall, confident, unshaken. Success, she began, her voice clear and steady, is often measured by achievements, profits, or recognition. But true success is built on something much deeper: integrity, resilience, and the courage to stand tall when everything around you tries to pull you down. She scanned the room, her gaze landing on young professionals, seasoned executives, and everyone in between. I've been asked many times how I stayed composed during one of the most challenging periods of my life. And the answer is simple. I focused on what I could control. When life became unpredictable, I held on to what I knew: my work ethic, my instincts, and my integrity. Those were the pillars that kept me standing. A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Valerie continued, I won't lie and say it was easy. There were nights when I questioned everything, when fear whispered in my ear that I wouldn't survive what was happening. But here's the truth. Fear only wins when we stop fighting. Her voice softened, but the emotion in her words was palpable. For those of you who are just starting your journey, remember this. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, don't ignore it. Document everything, protect yourself, and never let anyone convince you that your success is undeserved. The applause was thunderous. Valerie felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, smiling warmly. After her speech, a line formed as attendees waited to speak with her. A young woman with bright eyes and a hopeful smile approached first. Ms. Monroe, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Your story, it gave me so much hope. How did you find the strength to keep going when it felt like everything was against you? Valerie smiled gently. I reminded myself that the storm doesn't last forever, and even when the world feels like it's crumbling, we have the power to build something stronger from the pieces. The young woman nodded, gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Later that evening, as Valerie sat in her corner office overlooking the city lights of Atlanta, an email popped up on her screen. It was from the Henderson account, the very client Samantha had tried to sabotage her for, confirming a contract renewal for another 3 years. Valerie smiled softly, leaning back in her chair. The irony wasn't lost on her. This was exactly the kind of success Ryan and Samantha had tried to steal from her. But instead of revenge, Valerie focused on her future. Her assistant, Mariah, poked her head in. Late night again, Ms. Monroe? Valerie chuckled softly. Some habits die hard. Mariah grinned. Well, at least you're working on your terms now. Valerie nodded, glancing at the framed quote on her desk that read, Strength grows in the moments when you think you can't go on, but you keep going anyway. The next morning, a headline caught her eye. Former marketing executives Ryan Monroe and Samantha Davis begin prison sentences after high-profile attempted murder case. Valerie exhaled, setting her phone down. She had moved past the need to read about their fate. Her focus was forward, not behind. As she opened her laptop to start the day, she knew one thing for certain. No matter what life threw at her next, she was ready. The soft morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Valerie Monroe's office, casting a golden glow over the city skyline. A fresh cup of coffee sat on her desk, untouched as she reviewed the final proposal for her latest project. Life had changed drastically over the past year, but Valerie had embraced every moment of it. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mariah, her assistant. "Morning. Don't forget the mentorship kickoff at 10 a.m. They're all so excited to meet you." Valerie smiled. The mentorship program had become one of her proudest achievements, a way to give young professionals the guidance and support she wished she'd had when starting out. At 10 o'clock sharp, Valerie entered the conference room, where a dozen eager faces turned toward her. She saw a mix of excitement, nervousness, and hope reflected in their eyes. Taking a deep breath, she greeted them warmly. "Welcome," she began, her tone gentle but assured. "I started this mentorship program because I believe talent deserves to be nurtured, regardless of background or circumstances. Hard work, integrity, and perseverance should always be rewarded." She paused, looking at each of them. "Some of you may face challenges. Some of you might be underestimated. But let me tell you this, you are stronger than you realize. And with the right mindset, you can overcome anything." A young man raised his hand, his voice uncertain but sincere. "Ms. Monroe, how do you stay motivated when it feels like everything is working against you?" Valerie thought for a moment before answering. "I remind myself why I started. I focus on what I can control, and I surround myself with people who believe in me. And most importantly, I refuse to let fear dictate my future." The session ended with grateful smiles and hopeful handshakes. Valerie felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known before. She wasn't just building a career, she was building a legacy. Later that afternoon, Mariah entered her office with a cautious expression. "Valerie, there's something you might want to see." She handed Valerie her tablet showing a news article. Ryan Monroe and Samantha Davis begin 15-year prison sentences after attempted murder case. Valerie stared at the headline for a moment, the familiar pang of betrayal flickering through her. But instead of bitterness, she felt a quiet resolve. Setting the tablet down, she looked up at Mariah. "I don't need to read it," she said softly. "That chapter's closed." Mariah nodded, smiling. "You've come so far." "I have," Valerie agreed, a hint of pride in her voice. "And I'm not stopping now." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Valerie stood by her window, reflecting on her journey. Betrayal had threatened to break her, but she had risen above it. Her success wasn't built on revenge, it was built on resilience. With a renewed sense of purpose, she whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." Thank you for following Valerie's journey. If her story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories of strength, resilience, and hope. Share your thoughts below. What moments in your life made you stronger? We'd love to hear your story.